Greetings. In this tutorial we're going to have a look at the interface of Photoshop. We're going to start fairly basic today, and we're going to look specifically at how to select objects. Now this is an extremely important thing to do, especially when we're doing stuff like photo mashups, photo repairs and all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very important that we do understand some of the basics. Now I've got Photoshop opened up at the moment, and what I'm going to suggest that we do first of all, before we go into further detail, is we set up a new document. So I'm just going to maximize this for now, hit the green button, and I'm going to go to File and New, and when we first open up our document you'll see this opening page. So a new document, and we can name this whatever we like, and then we can choose our document type. So there's a few different defaults here. You can get film and video, and then go to size, and there's a whole lot of variations on different set stuff for film. But in this case we're going to be doing a presentation that we may wish to print. So I'm going to go to international paper, and I'm going to make sure I'm on A4. Now you'll notice that it'll have the actual sizings with height and resolution. So A4 print resolution is 300 pixels per inch, and you can change any of these to whether you want pixels, inches, etc. You can choose to have a background. I usually stick with the default being white, and we also need to make sure that our color mode is set to RGB, but this should be a default anyway. Once we've done that, we hit OK, and in this case I've got my page set up as portrait mode. Depending on which version of Photoshop you're using, you may have the option to choose whether it's portrait or landscape, but that's not a big deal. I'm actually going to change this to landscape right now. I'm going to go to Image, down to Image Rotation, and go to 90-degree clockwise or counterclockwise, and this is going to allow us to reorient our page. Now later on I will show you how to create your own page and stretch and reduce and stuff like that. But let's start with this. Now one of the reasons why I want to start with A4 300 dpi is because we're going to be placing some photo images on there, and I want to make sure that the photos are going to be of a decent enough resolution. So I'm just going to minimize this for now, just slightly. I have a folder over here, faces for deep etching. Now deep etching basically refers to cutting out, in a sense. Now we're going to start off really basic. I've got this robot folder here, and I'm just going to drag this into Photoshop, and it's going to place my image in there, and I'm going to hit enter. Now interestingly enough, what happens if you drag an image into Photoshop, into an open document, it will place it over here in our layers panel. Now before we do anything with this, I'm just going to make note of a few different setups for this. So Photoshop does have multiple setups. I'm just going to maximize this again. I'm going to go to Window, go down to Workspace, and you'll notice that there's a whole lot of selections here. So some of you may be noticing that your sidebars and toolbars potentially are quite different. I'm currently in Photography Workspace, which is not too bad. I'm actually going to move this to Essentials, which is sort of the stock standard that most of you will see when you first start up. And if it's still looking a bit weird, you can also go to Workspace and go to Reset Essentials. So you'll see Photoshop now has 3D motion painting, photography, graphics, and Essentials. Quick look at this as well. If we zoom down, we can see that we can actually turn on and off things like layers, libraries, properties, color, etc. And we've also got our tools, which is over here, and various other things we can have turned on and off. So there's quite a few options in here. What I typically recommend is we start cleaning up what we don't need. Now we can do this by, so for example, this color palette, I can rip that off and then turn that off. Same with the swatches if I'm not going to need them. Libraries I'm not going to need at the moment. It's going to be fairly simple. So I recommend closing down whatever you don't need. I'm going to do it via the window. Libraries I don't need. Properties, adjustments, and these options down here, layers, channels, and paths, and that should be enough for that. So back to the basics. Over here on our layers panel we have our layers. We obviously have the background, and we now have our robot layer in there as well. If you notice this check pattern here, this is basically showing that this is a invisible area. This is our background of what we will see. We have a white page in front as the background, and we have our image on top. Our very first tool is our selection tool. If you hover over a button for any period of time, it should come up with the shortcut. In the case for this one, it is V. If you click on it there, move tool, and you've got artboard tool. We're not going to play around with the artboard tool at the moment anyway. And our move tool, by selecting on the object, we can move it around. Fairly simple. A couple of quick things with this. A lot of you will work with auto select turned on, and that works pretty well, but I'll give you an example of what that basically means. It means that if I am selected on something else, say the background layer, and I click on the other layer directly, it will automatically select it. Now that's pretty cool most of the time. In this instance, I kind of do recommend not having that ticked on, because as we get more detailed, it means that you might accidentally start clicking on layers that you don't want to work on. There is an option to have this toggled on and off, and that's just by hitting Control or Command on Mac, and that will allow you to toggle that on and off, and you can just click back on. So it's still there, like so. We've also got an option to show transformation controls if you wish. So I might leave this on for display purposes. So there it is there. Okay, so there's our object. Actually, I'm going to turn that off, it's distracting. Now when I've dragged this object in, it has asked me to place it. This is placed as a smart object, and this is identified over here in the controls here. Smart object, in a nutshell, basically means it retains a whole lot of information of when it's first placed. Very, very handy, and I'm going to give you a quick example of why it's so important. So over on my layer panel, I'm going to duplicate this by bringing it down to this little icon here. It looks like a page with the corner turned, to duplicate my layer. There it is, robot copy. Now please keep in mind that Photoshop has multiple ways of doing the same thing. You can duplicate up in your layer panel, you can right click in the layers panel, and you can go to duplicate layer as well. So multiple ways of doing this. And I'm going to grab these two layers and I'm going to put them side by side, something like that. Now they're both smart objects, and this is just as a quick example. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call robot one smart. So just simply by clicking the text we can rename these things, and robot rasterized. Now by rasterizing this, I'm going to select on my layer here, I'm going to right click and go to rasterize layer, and you'll notice that the little icon has disappeared. Some smart objects won't allow you to do some effects, which is because it needs to be basically turned back into pixels. So some filters and some transformations and warps and stuff, smart objects won't be applied to. So at some point you may need to rasterize your objects, and it's important that you remember how to do that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select on both of these, and I'm going to transform them. I'm going to go to edit and transform, and you've got a whole lot of options here: scale, rotate, skew, distort, perspective, etc. Free transform is Command or Control T. So T for transform. I can select two or more at a time by shift selecting, and I'm going to Control T, and I'm going to grab the corner of one of these and start scaling. Now you'll notice when I start scaling, I can scale this and stretch it and do sorts of things. What I recommend is to maintain the aspect ratio, you hold down the shift key. As soon as I hold that down, there it is, it's going to maintain that scale. I'm going to shift this into the middle, and we can rotate it if we want to. I'm going to Control or Command Z that, and I'm going to shift down. I'm going to make these both really, really small. Once I've made them really small, I'm going to hit the tick key, or hit enter. So you can choose to not transform, or you can yes transform. And then I'm going to rescale them up, and let's see what happens. So I'm going to go Command or Control T for transform again. I'm going to grab one of the corners, holding down Shift again. I'm going to scale these up, and there they are. And then I'm going to hit the tick key, and what you'll notice is we've got a really interesting difference here. The smart object, and Control plus, Control or Command plus or minus to zoom in, zoom out, and spacebar to move around. The one which is still a smart object, this one on the left, you'll notice hasn't lost any of the information. The one that has been rasterized has become very blurry. So what's happened there is it's been broken down into its pixel format. It's been shrunk down, and it maintains that. So when we scale it back up, it's going to appear blurry. Now, important to remember, in Photoshop we are dealing with pixels. So if we zoom in really closely, let's get some contrast. I'm using the space bar to shuffle around. We can see that every image in Photoshop overall is made out of pixels, unless we go with vector stuff, which we'll look at in a little bit. So all these little squares, which is why it's important to make sure that we deal with decent size images. So I do recommend that you work, especially for print stuff, work off an A4 page. That way you can always make sure your images are going to be high enough resolution. Alright, I'm going to get rid of this rasterized one. I'm just going to hit delete, or you can hit the garbage bin. And I'm going to move this guy into the middle, and I'm going to scale him back up again. Control T. Let's scale him back up. So let's have a quick look at some of the selection tools that we can use. Once we've done this, and once we understand all these, this is going to make our future work really simple. And there's a few to look at. So here's my robot. What I typically like doing is duplicating that and hiding a previous one. So it's good to have a backup. It saves you having to try and find if you've deleted the original file or something like that. And let's say we destroy this one somehow. We've always got a backup, so that's usually why I do that. And let's have a look at selecting some of these things, and I'm going to go through these step by step. Let's start with the very second tool down. So first tool is our move tool. Our second tool is the ellipse tool, and if I left click on that, we can see rectangular marquee tool, elliptical marquee tool, and we've got single row and single column, but we're going to mainly focus on these two. And basically what these do is they allow you to click and drag and create a rectangle, which is fair enough, and that's allowing you to select in that area. Now I can add to this by holding down Shift, and I can add another shape like so. I can subtract from this by holding down Alt, and you'll notice a little negative sign appears, and subtract from that. I can change my shape and add to that and subtract to that, and I can make all these weird and wonderful shapes. Now that's not really helping us out for our shape. Our shape is a lot of bendy shapes, and doing something like that isn't always the most effective way of selecting and moving stuff. So I'm going to deselect that. Of course, once it's selected, we can go to our move tool, and we might need to actually rasterize this guy now. I'm going to go right click at rasterize, and that's one of the reasons why we may need to rasterize an object. Smart objects you can't break apart like this, and I can move that. I can also copy and paste this, Control C, Control V, and there it is. But the best way of doing that, if you are going to do that, is Command or Control J, and that will copy and paste in place. If you go up to here to edit, you can see you've got copy, and you got paste as well. And if you go special paste, you can go paste in place, which is pretty good, all in one. Just remember, with Photoshop, Control or Command Z to step back. If you hit Command or Control Z again, it will redo, so it'll keep jumping backwards and forwards. If you want to keep stepping backwards for your undos, it's Control or Command Alt and Z. So hold that, and it will allow you to keep stepping backwards. And there it is there in Edit. Okay, let's get rid of that. So while these marquee selection tool, elliptical tools are really great for shapes and stuff like that, they might not be all that great for this particular character because it is kind of original shape. So I'm going to jump into the next tool, Lasso tool. There's 3 options for this. Please note that the shortcut is on, if you click on something on long enough, it'll bring up different options. Shortcut for this is L, the Lasso tool, and there are 3 types: the standard, polygonal, and magnetic. Now let's have a quick look at those. The standard is pretty straightforward. I'm going to hit Control plus to zoom in, and while it is kind of handy, it's pretty difficult to use. It's basically going to, if we're trying to select that, it's it's a bit difficult to control, especially if you're using a mouse. And as soon as you're finished, it's going to close off the shape. Now we can add to this again, holding down Shift. This is pretty common with a lot of the tools. It's going to allow you to add, and holding down Alt, of course, is going to allow you to subtract. So that's pretty handy, but Lasso tool's not really doing it. The next one is the polygonal. I'm going to hit Control D to deselect, or you can click outside. Hit back delete again once if you need to step back when you're making a selection with the Lasso tool. And the Lasso tool, polygonal Lasso tool, allows you to click and then move to a particular place. Now again, this particular robot's not all that great for this. There's not that many straight lines. Let's zoom in a little bit more for that. But it allows you to click, hold down spacebar to move, click, click, click. If you double click, it will close off the shape again. But as I said, you can hold down Shift and continue building a shape. Control Z if you accidentally click too many times, and holding down Alt brings up that negative, and you can subtract a space from there. So works fairly well. The final one is the magnetic lasso tool. I'm going to hit Control D again. This one is basically runs off contrast. So if there's a strong contrast between our colors or our values, it will start running along, and it'll, with a rough estimate, it'll start selecting, and it'll run along and it'll place little points. If our points start getting a little bit out of control, hit delete, and it will start stepping back from that. Now this one is a little bit finicky. I'm not going to get too much detail, but you can change some things around in this, including contrast and frequency, so how often it places a marker and stuff like that. In honesty, it's okay, but most of the time I don't end up using it. It ends up being more time consuming to fix up than anything else, so I'm going to leave that one alone. So that's our very first tool. I'm going to jump into the next one straight away, and it's right below. It's the wand and quick selection tool. The shortcut is W, and we're going to have a quick look at that. Now let's start with the wand. Let's start with the wand tool. Please note the top bar here has information. Every time you select a new tool, it's going to vary. So there's a few things we need to be aware of when using this. Now I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and use the space bar to readjust, and let's have a quick look at this. So we're going to ignore this first lot here. We're going to get to tolerance, and then we're going to have a look at these little options here. So if I want to select just this big blue area, I can select, and just simply by clicking in there, and it does a pretty damn good job. Now remember, this is a big solid color for the most part, so it's going to select that, and if I click to V for move, you can see it's done all right. If I hold down shift, I can now select another area. Hold down shift, another area, and again, if I want to take away an area, hold down alt. So you can start seeing that there is a similar thing. Remember, Control D to deselect completely. Now there are some things we need to be aware of here. Now I'm going to select in this Control D deselect. I'm going to select in this blue box part here. Click, there it is. It's selected here. It's missing out these white bits. It's missing out these dark lines, and it's done a pretty good job of selecting just that area. Now the thing we want to look at is the tolerance. Now if we look closely, we'll see that there is a color variation in this, light blue and a slightly darker blue, and it's picked up both of those. So what we can do is we can actually play around with the tolerance. The higher the tolerance, the more it's going to allow closeness of colors. So if I ramp up the tolerance really high, let's try that. I'm going to Control D deselect. I'm going to click back in the blue again, and what you'll see is it started pushing into these leg areas. So it's gone, you know what, that's close enough. Let's push that in there. If I push it even higher, Control D deselect, click back in there, you'll notice now it's picked out these outer areas. And if we take it all the way to the maximum, 255, it's pretty much, it's pushed pretty damn far. So you know, it's not getting to the yellow parts, but it's actually, you know, selected everything but the yellow almost. So it's even selected the background, which has got a slight pale blue section on it. So I'm going to deselect that, back to wand. So you know, be aware of the tolerance. The lower the tolerance, it's going to get very finicky. If we take this down to something very low, you can actually see it's going to get very picky, especially as we start getting towards the edges there. And what you'll notice is there are some slight color variations in that, so that's why it's being a little bit finicky of that. So be wary of your tolerance. I think 32 is about the default, but you know, do play around with that. Alright, the next one we're going to have a quick look at is continuous. So continuous basically means that if I have that ticked on, it's going to click, and when it runs into a border, it's going to stop. So there's a nice little border, it's a little box, it's being stopped by this white area, it's being stopped by these bits, so it's not going out. If I untick that, it's going to say, alright, I want to select this color, or this variation of color. Where else is it? I'm not going to be bothered by the borders. Anything that color or that color variation, it's going to select, and there it is. So it's now selected the kneecaps, the feet, and the helmet, and that's within its color range. There it is, moving around. So anywhere it's able to spill out from there, as far as it being encased, I'm going to give you a quick example of that. I'm going to go B for brush. I'm going to hit Alt, bring up my color picker. And there's our primary and secondary color choices there, and I'm going to brush a quick line between there and there. I'm going to go to wand. I'm going to turn back continuous on. Remember, continuous is where we could select an area and it would stop, and if I click in there, it's now seeped through there into this area and it's filled out there. So it's very important to remember which one continuous is on. Sample or layers very simply means that if we have an additional character, so if I duplicate this robot, I'm going to just make a duplicate of him there, but put him off to the side, and there's my original, and I'm going to go wand, and let's have continuous back on. There's the helmet there. Let's untick continuous. It's selected everything of the same color there, but it hasn't selected this guy here. He's on a separate layer, so I'm going to click sample layers, and there he is. He's now selected on a separate layer. There's one more thing I just do want to really mention with this, and this ties back to Photoshop working on pixels, and this is it being a bitmap image. So I'm going to quickly show you that. As I said, if we zoom in really close, what we'll start seeing is there is, number one, some slight little variations in color, and also it's not really a sharp line because it's all made up of little squares. Photoshop tries to make it look curved, so from a distance, if your resolution is high enough, it will look curved. And we go wand, and we'll notice it's got anti-alias ticked on. What anti-alias is, it's attempting to add little in-between selections, so it's trying to get that curve happening. It's pretty good for doing photos and stuff like that. If we're doing vectors, we may not want that on. I'm going to show you why. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to duplicate that. So I'm going to copy and paste in place, or Command J. And there it is there. And I'm going to redo that. Bring back my object again. I'm going to go wand. I'm going to untick anti-aliased. I'm going to click again. And I'm going to go Command J to duplicate. And then I'm going to grab that one that I've just created, and I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, and Flip horizontally. I'm going to go V for my selection tool. Again, I'm doing this as a demo, so we will get back into this. I'm just going to move it across, just so we can see a mirror image step by step. And once we do that, we can see something really kind of interesting as we zoom in. This one on the right, this is our original. This is with anti-aliased turned on, and you can see it's kind of got these half white areas where it's kind of tried to blend in. With anti-alias ticked on, it's very straight to the line. It makes a decision and it goes, right, that's the point where we stop off. So it's going to look a lot more jagged. So if you're noticing that when you're creating things and they become very jagged, that is because anti-alias is turned off. It goes down to the block ending as opposed to blurring it off. Again, different uses. This is more for sharp vector sort of stuff, and the one on the right with anti-alias turned on is better for soft images, so stuff like photography. So something to keep aware of. And we are back. Now I'm going to stop this there. We're going to have a quick look at a few other techniques in another video.